Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to share a talk with you today called The Social Responsibility of Software Engineers. By way of introduction, my name is Coraline Ehmke. I've been in software forever and in open source for as long as I could be. I'm best known for the creation of Contributor Covenant, which is the first and most popular open source code of conduct. Um, in 2018, I spoke at the United Nations on the topic of human rights abuses by tech corporations. And in 2019, I was moved to create the Hippocratic License, an open license that is tied to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. And I'm also the founder and executive director of the Organization for Ethical Source. I want to start today by telling you a story. In the 1960s, amidst growing tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, a computer scientist published a short piece that he called The Parable of the Locksmith. And this is my retelling. One day, a mysterious stranger walked into a locksmith shop and he came with a proposition. He said, "I have a job that needs doing and it requires someone with your highly specialized skills. I've done my research and you are one of the smartest and most capable locksmiths in the city." Locksmith felt flattered and a little intrigued. The man continued, "I want to hire you to open a certain safe. Never mind whose safe it is, that's none of your concern. Just do the job I hire you to do, and I will make you rich beyond your wildest dreams." The locksmith was excited at the proposition of such a lucrative job, but he was a bit nervous about not knowing who the safe belonged to. It seemed suspicious. But the stranger went on, "There are certain conditions you have to agree to. For example, I'm going to blindfold you and take your phone away before I bring you to the safe's location. And you can never tell anyone that I hired you." It struck the locksmith again as odd and kind of suspicious, but he thought about what the man had said about making him rich. He felt like he'd struggled all his life and was never rewarded for the hard work he put in day after day. The stranger continued, "You can have all the tools you need to do the job, the very best tools. I will spare no expense. Take your time, think it over. I'll be back tomorrow for your answer." Despite his hesitation about the nature of the job, how suspicious it seemed, the locksmith spent all night thinking about his crummy apartment, his shabby furniture, his daughter's dream of one day going to college. From the beginning, his family had always had to scrimp and save just to get by. And anyway, he told himself, if I don't take this job, he'll just go to another locksmith. The next day, when the stranger returned, the locksmith agreed to take the job. After multiple blindfolded trips to and from some unknown location, the locksmith finally cracked the safe. He wasn't allowed to see what was inside of it. As soon as the lock clicked open, the stranger blindfolded him again. But true to his word, the stranger made the locksmith exceedingly rich. We're going to come back to this parable and find out what happened when the safe was opened in just a few minutes. But first, another story. This is an HP LaserJet. It was one of the first laser printers on the market in 1983. At the time, a man named Richard Stallman was working at an AI lab at Xerox. The lab had one of these printers, and it was cutting-edge technology. The only problem was it constantly jammed. Now, the lab had time-sharing software. You had to book time for various resources, like the printer. But if you set aside and booked 30 minutes for the printer and it jammed 3 minutes into the job, of course, you'd be upset. So Stallman and his colleagues decided that they would modify the printer driver so that it would report jams back to the time-sharing software and notify people about printer jams. But the software was proprietary, and HP wouldn't share the source code. Someone found out that a colleague at MIT had the source code, but that person had signed a non-disclosure agreement and was not able to share it. Stallman got really angry, and it wasn't really about the printer. It was about the fact that he saw the world shifting toward proprietary software. And this incident would actually lead to the creation of the free software movement. For context, in the mid-90s, when the rest of the world started to discover the internet, free software was a very popular choice for web servers. Apache was the most used web server. Many systems were built on a common stack called LAMP. Linux kernel at the base, Apache with web services, MySQL for database, and Perl or PHP for dynamic pages. All of them are open source technologies. Christine Peterson coined the term open source in 1998. And that same year, the open source definition was penned by Bruce Perens. 9 months later, the Open Source Initiative was founded to promote the use of open source software. And over the past 20 years, the open source community has come to thrive, enjoying wild success and permanently changing the technology landscape. But the world has also changed in the past 2 decades. Around the world, we're seeing technology being leveraged to commit human rights abuses on an alarming scale. And the technology powering these abuses includes free and open source software. Open source software today is increasingly being used in programs of mass surveillance, anti-immigrant violence, protester suppression, racially biased policing, and the development and use of cruel and inhumane weapons. And open source's complicity in this isn't a bug, it's a feature. This is by design. Freedom zero. The open source definition allows for the use of software for any purpose, including explicitly for evil. And the OSI says giving everyone freedom means giving evil people freedom too. But under what other circumstances in human civilization do we grant complete freedom to evil people? There's increasingly discussion among open source developers in our communities about our ethical responsibilities as creators. The debates are heated, to say the least. It's a very touchy topic. The fundamental question seems to be, are we responsible for how the technologies we develop are used? And a lot of us are beginning to accept that our work in open source might be contributing to human rights violations and other atrocities in the US and around the world. In response to these issues, we're seeing increased interest in ethical source licenses, including a Hippocratic license. As creators, we feel powerless and we want to find some way to do the right thing. We're horrified by what's happening in the world, and we're horrified at the thought that we may be contributing to it in some way. But the conversation about ethics and computing is not new. It's been happening in our field since before there was even such thing as software. I want to introduce you to a man named Edmund Berkeley. Berkeley was one of the most important pioneers of ethics and computer science in the 20th century, yet almost no one knows who he is. He got to start working on computers with the Navy during World War II. He even worked side by side with Grace Hopper. They were colleagues. And he published the world's first computer magazine. And Berkeley was also among the first to propose the idea of personal computers. Berkeley co-founded the Association for Computing Machinery, the ACM, at Columbia University in 1947. And their charter is to, quote, foster the open interchange of information and promote the highest professional and ethical standards. Berkeley sat on the Committee for the Social Responsibility of Computer People, which published a historic and foundational report in 1958. The findings of the report boil down into 4 simple statements. First of all, that as computer scientists, we cannot rightly ignore our social responsibilities. Secondly, that our social responsibilities can't be delegated to other people. Third, that we can't neglect to think about how our special role can benefit or harm society. In other words, we must consider how our special capabilities can help advance socially desirable applications and prevent undesirable outcomes. And finally, we cannot avoid deciding between conflicting responsibilities. We must think how to choose. The report went on to say that when one reflects upon the great forces that we computer people are associated with, it's no longer difficult to grasp and perhaps even to accept our heavier than average share of responsibility. The committee believed they saw that given the power and potential of computers, ethical considerations were paramount. The report concluded the scientist's credo, knowledge for knowledge's sake, easily comes into conflict with our ethical responsibilities. Given human society in our century and the ethical value system we're using, we can label some classes of work as obviously socially desirable in other classes of work is obviously socially undesirable, and acknowledge there's a large middle ground which cannot be clearly classified. It was Berkeley who wrote the parable of the locksmith. And remember, it was the height of the Cold War when he wrote it. The parable ends this way. A week after finishing the job, the retired locksmith saw a news headline about the theft of top secret military schematics. And soon after that, the stranger himself appeared on the world stage, declared himself master of all nations, backed by the overwhelming threat of a devastating stolen superweapon. Berkeley goes on to ask, did the locksmith do what was right? And he contended that the locksmith had the responsibility to determine whether the stranger was a criminal before agreeing to work with him. He had signs that something was wrong. He had his suspicions, but he ignored them. So no, the locksmith did not do what was right. And Berkeley concluded that the computer scientist doesn't have the right to shut their eyes in regard to their responsibilities either, any more than the locksmith has. And Berkeley called on his colleagues to shoulder their proper social responsibilities. And he was largely ignored. Fast forward about a decade, it's 1972, the Vietnam War is raging. Berkeley and his colleague Franz Alt had been invited to address the ACM at a special dinner, honoring them as founders of the organization. It was the ACM's 25th anniversary celebration. Franz Alt went first. His topic was reflections, and Berkeley was to address the more forward-looking topic of horizons. While Alt's talk was celebratory, providing a retrospective on all the advances in computer engineering and computer science since World War II, but Berkeley's speech took on a distinctly different tone. Berkeley told the audience that anyone who is working to further the unethical uses of computers, including the use of computers in developing weapons technology, should quit their job. He called out members of the audience by name. Many of his colleagues were so upset by his comments that they stood up and walked out in the middle of his speech. And sadly, Admiral Grace Hopper was among those who stood up and left. Berkeley concluded his speech by saying it was a gross neglect of responsibility, that computer scientists were not considering their impact in terms of societal benefit or societal harm. The 1933 census in Nazi Germany used technology and services provided by IBM and provided to be pivotal to the Nazis in their efforts to identify and destroy the country's Jewish and Romani minorities. IBM is widely accepted to be considered complicit in the Holocaust. The Nazis even shipped IBM punch cards on the trains to concentration camps. So how would you feel if your work had contributed to IBM census technology? And other scientists faced similar dilemmas. World War I saw the first large-scale deployment of chemical weapons, and the horrors of death by poison gas, once they became common knowledge, had repercussions throughout the chemical production world. Between the 1918 armistice and 1933, there were multiple international conferences held to try to limit or abolish chemical weapons. And to this day, in the US, no chemical manufacturer will produce a solution used for death by by lethal injection. Then, after seeing the inhumane devastation of the atomic bomb at the end of World War II, scientists actively sought to eliminate the bomb threat to civilization. They started the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, which became the voice for the ethical responsibilities of physicists. And of course, they launched the Doomsday Clock Project, which continues to this day, as a reminder of the danger of doing nothing. And how did our community, how did our industry deal with our ethical conflict and the realization that we might be complicit in genocide and other atrocities? We got up and left the room. And that shirking responsibility is pervasive in the open source world today too. How would we feel about the complicity of IBM in the Holocaust if their punch card system had been released under the MIT license? That is exactly the situation we're facing now. In 1998, when the open source definition was penned, for context, the great evil that we were facing in our industry was the market domination of the Microsoft operating system and the Internet Explorer browser. And I think that's really important for understanding the context under which the four freedoms in the open source definition were written. The founding thinkers responsible for free and open software understood the impact of technology on society, but they wanted to prioritize maximizing the freedom of adopters, and they considered open to be the primary ethical consideration in software. But in 2021, we face greater threats than market domination by Microsoft. We're in an age where governments are carrying out programs of mass surveillance, using facial recognition to interfere with legitimate political protests, using technology to carry out state-sanctioned genocide and violence. In 1999, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan announced the United Nations Global Compact. The pact to encourage businesses worldwide to adopt sustainable and socially responsible policies. It's the world's largest corporate responsibility initiative and has 13,000 corporate participants in 170 countries. The very first section of the compact deals with human rights. It states that businesses should support and respect the protection of internationally proclaimed human rights, and businesses must make sure that they are not complicit in human rights abuses. And complicity has two different contexts. The first is providing goods or services that a company knows will be used to carry out abuses. But the second is when a company benefits from human rights abuses, even without positively assisting or causing them. So what does that have to do with open source? Let's take a well-known example, Palantir Technologies, software company co-founded by top Trump advisor Peter Thiel, and they collect tens of millions of dollars from ICE every year, continuing to this day. Didn't stop with Biden's election. And at present, Palantir has over 200 repositories on GitHub, which in turn rely on thousands of open source projects. So really, every dependency and use by Palantir and therefore ICE is contributing in some way to human rights violations. Palantir is explicitly leveraging open source software to aid and abet ICE's human rights abuses, and it's not alone. Many large tech companies have been happily profiting from human rights abuses for years, not even talking about surveillance capitalism and its prevalence, but I've been calling for people who have the safety and privilege to do so, like Berkeley did, to accept their ethical responsibilities and organize for change or quit their jobs. And this includes tech workers at Amazon, Microsoft, GitHub, Salesforce, and many others. All of these companies leverage open source technologies to profit from human rights abuses. According to the United Nations definition, these companies are complicit. And we know that open source software is being used to power these violations. Are we going to also get up and leave the room when we're faced with our own role in abuses like these? I believe that as technologists, we have a moral imperative to prevent our work from being used to harm others. And responsibility is about impact, not intent. It doesn't matter if we didn't intend for there to be harm. We have to take responsibility for what happens. Freedom for freedom's sake is incompatible with our responsibility to society. Software freedom must not come before human freedom. A proprietary printer driver sparked a massive paradigm shift in software development. Stallman saw what he perceived as an ethical problem and created a brilliant hack to solve it with licensing. Today, we have much bigger problems than proprietary software. Stallman wanted a printer driver. We want to prevent our work from being used for human rights abuses. That's what our revolution is about. I founded the Ethical Source Movement to empower us to take responsibility for our impact, to find ways to promote justice and equity in our work, to ensure that our work is being used for social good, to prevent the harm caused by pretending that technology is neutral. We're all inspired by the promise of free and open, but we also need to accept responsibility for impact and outcomes. Because in the end, we're all locksmiths, and the world is full of mysterious strangers. Thank you for listening. Looks like there are some questions. If companies such as Palantir stop publishing their code, aren't we in danger of losing insight into what they are doing? Their code doesn't really, it's not like they have an application that says, hey, put kids in cages, the work they're actually doing, that is closed source, but they have a lot of open source dependencies and a lot of open source projects that folks are contributing to that are being used in the technologies that they provide to organizations like ICE. So really, it's not a matter of their code being open, it's rather how they're leveraging open code to carry out these abuses. And in fact, another aspect of this is that GitHub and open source are recruiting tools, and we can't ignore the fact that that by participating in the open source ecosystem, companies like Palantir are recruiting people to work even more directly on technologies which are being used to carry out these abuses. Hope that answers your question. Oops. Okay. And Wayne asks, it's non-trivial to pre-screen users of software. How do you envision this happening? It's not so much a matter of a pre-screening, but rather creating incentives for folks to look for to work toward pro-social outcomes, and we can achieve things like that in different ways. And really, we're at the beginning of a period where we're even talking about or thinking about these problems. So, obviously, what we started with Ethical Source was the Hippocratic license. We have other licenses in development. And we're also hoping to release the Hippocratic License 3.0 at some point this year. But licensing is just one prong in a broader strategy. I believe that we have to start inside our creator communities, inside our open source communities, and make sure that we're centering justice and equity in the way that we do our work. And that involves things like strongly, fairly, and transparently enforced codes of conduct. It means things like explicit governance. It means things like taking our time as we are either thinking of or even creating these technologies, considering how they may be abused, how they could be used to cause harm, not only for users, but for the people that software is used on. And that goes beyond IP, right? That goes beyond IP. But a license is like one mechanism that we are trying to explore to hold companies accountable, to hold adopters accountable. And yes, it's hard. And yes, it's unproven. But really, open source licenses in general are, in a way, they're experimental too. Not a lot of them have been tested in court definitively. And I think we're in the same kind of period with ethical source that we were with open source at the beginning, where lots of experimentation, lots of licenses, and lots of different techniques for trying to achieve our goals. I don't have the answers. We don't have the answers. This is a very new effort. So what I hope that what I'm trying to do with the Organization for Ethical Source is to avoid trying to solve these problems from first principles. The Organization for Ethical Source, we have about 250 members now, and I would say that that open source contributors and maintainers and software developers and engineers probably make up about half of our membership body. We have to take an interdisciplinary and global approach to solving these problems. So the other half of the OES membership, ethicists, philosophers, writers, academics, journalists, human rights and aid workers, sociologists, folks who study governance. It's going to take an effort like that. It's going to take a multidisciplinary effort like that, which we are not used to in our industry, right? We believe that we can just sit down and solve every problem from first principles, and that's really not practical. So that's the work that we are doing, and it's very exciting work, and it's very critical work. And if you're interested in helping that work, go to ethicalsource.dev/join, or yeah, I think join. Okay, Ram asked about hardware. Hardware is absolutely included, absolutely belongs in this in this framework. We do not have a lot of folks from the open hardware movement in the OES yet. That's an area where we'd like to do some more outreach. But yes, you're absolutely correct. That is also very critical. Okay. Norman asked, how can we promote the social responsibility where there's so much resistance to it? Revolution. That's what we're doing. In an earlier version of this talk, I talk about how I talk about a book by Thomas Kuhn called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And Kuhn posits there are three possible outcomes when a conflict between the old guard and people who are focused on new issues or issues that the establishment doesn't really consider right now. Three options. The first is the traditional organizations ignore the problem and hope it goes away. And no, we're not accepting that. The second option is where our existing organizations and structures accommodate a new idea or a new challenge and shift focus to start putting energy into solving some of those newer problems. And I tried that. I actually ran for the board of the OSI. And the third option, if the establishment doesn't want to address these problems, the third option is revolution. And that's a very loaded word, but in a way, that is what we're doing. We've essentially said, if y'all don't want to deal with these problems, we're going to create an organization that will deal with these problems. And that's the work that I'm doing right now. I think I have answered all of your questions. I totally agree, Robert, about Kuhn. And honestly, we tried. We actually had the president of the OSI, Josh Simmons, invited to our organization, and before we were an organization, we were simply a Slack community, and he never participated. Robert, I don't know how much time we have. Why don't you go ahead and ask your question? Paula asked an incredibly important question. How can we navigate difficult conversations on what individuals believe to be ethical when people can hold different ideals? And this calls back, I tried to, I was kind of alluding to this with that report. They said there are certain kinds of activities or work that are clearly socially, clearly pro-social, beneficial to society, and some that are clearly harmful, and there is a middle ground. That's why with the Hippocratic License we tied it to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is everyone in the world, every nation in the world saying, yes, we agree. These are the minimum rights that we as human beings have. Human rights violations are pretty black and white. Child slavery, human trafficking, ICE. These things are not the gray area that people are afraid of. And in fact, just because there's gray area doesn't mean we can simply throw up our hands and say, it's too hard of a problem to solve. I hope that answers your question. Wayne asks, OSS is really just a tool. Well, I've heard a lot of people say, open source is like a hammer. And you can use a hammer to kill someone. Does that mean we should stop making hammers? No. But if you're a hammer manufacturer and your largest client is a gang of street thugs who kill people with hammers, it's not quite the same thing, and you can't really talk about the neutrality of technology. Pretending that tech is neutral is a way for us to absolve ourselves of responsibility. Think about something like deepfakes. Oh, it's neutral, it's just a tool. It's so obvious for some of these technologies. It's so obvious that the primary use case is going to be abuse. And one of the important questions we should ask ourselves before we even create something, we have to think about how can this be used or abused. And if the risk of abuse or the potential for harm is greater, maybe there are some things that we shouldn't be building. Maybe there are certain technologies that we shouldn't be developing. Again, that calls back to what they said. Knowledge for knowledge's sake is incompatible with our responsibility to society. Okay, here's the question. The dismissed question was, you can choose the type of application that will be ethically licensed. What sort of application would you focus on? I would say that's a really good question. I would say those technologies maybe that are not quite foundational. Um, that's a I would actually, Robert, I don't want to answer this question live. Um, I think this is something that we're still working on. I don't have a good answer for that. I'm sorry. I will say that I don't think licensing is the answer. Is the only answer, and I think communities should carefully consider, and there should be consensus on the kind of licensing that the creator community wants to publish their work through, and it's really kind of a personal decision. And if the maintainers believe that maybe this is a technology that does have a high risk of use or abuse, that would be when you would want to consider an ethical license. But one thing I do want to emphasize, again, licensing is only one strategy. There are lots of other strategies that we're developing. The thing that we have to accomplish, we have to accept that corporations are amoral. Not immoral necessarily, some are, but corporations at best are amoral. They are not in the business of making ethical decisions, and they're going to do whatever is optimized for their business model and for their corporate goals, profit, adoption, things like that. So what we have to do, we can't expect corporations to be moral actors because they're not going to be. They're not incentivized to be. It's expensive to be. So what we have to do is create incentives for them to do the right thing, and we have to use our leverage, our untapped leverage, in defining or in creating, like I said, incentives for them to do the right thing. I hope that hope that made sense. Oh, a couple more in QA. Regarding enforcement, for lack of a better word, since right now the people making the laws, for example, my senators here in Texas, don't give a damn about human rights, are the same ones cutting checks to companies like Palantir and bolstering police budgets so they can use facial recognition and so on. How can we shut down dangerous uses of these technologies when we see them? I think in a lot of cases, we this really highlights the fact that that we can't rely on. A common criticism I see of licenses like the Hippocratic is that, that's not the right approach. We should lobby our representatives. We should work with our governments. But state actors can be just as dangerous as private actors and private corporations and these sorts of things. It's they're in bed together. And as we see now in the U.S., it's very obvious. It's been obvious for a long time for a lot of people. Yeah, we don't give a shit about human rights either. So we can't really rely on state actors. We have to find other ways to use our leverage to kind of make them try and make them do the right thing, or at least prevent harm as much as possible. It is very complicated. We are not going to be able to do it alone. It will take a concerted effort, but we should do what is within our power to do. We can't say it's too big of a problem. We can't say, oh, my state legislator is, an awful person and doesn't care about stuff like this. We do have leverage. We do have power. And we have to start using it. And when you said you followed up, the main point was that we need to be looking at social solutions as it is a human social problem. And yeah. Well, if there's nothing else, y'all, I'm gonna drop off. I hope you enjoyed the talk, And strongly encourage you to visit ethicalsource.dev and look at the work we're doing and consider if you would like to join us in this critical work. Thanks, folks. Bye.